I had assumed the education/race issue would be one of our major ones, given the kind of dislocations we saw in the 60s, the segregation, desegregation, attempts at integration, and so on. When you move beyond those, are there any, and it's interesting that the stories you pick out are stories that, while they have a unique Delaware twist, are not unique to Delaware. Any kinds of stories that you look at that would be unique to Delaware? We chatted briefly outside just as a thought starter. One that some folks in here will remember, but very frankly some won't, was the near bankruptcy of the state of Delaware from the near collapse of Farmers Bank.
Yeah, that was, that clearly disrupted a lot of things and led to the dissolution of that bank as the state's repository. It was also about that time, the other banking issue that surfaced there was the Financial Center Development Act, which is unique to Delaware because it by eliminating usury ceilings and enacting certain tax breaks for corporations has brought somewhere in the neighborhood of 75,000 jobs to Delaware over the last decade and a half.
For the people in the audience who are not familiar with the Farmers Bank issue, that dated to roughly 1976 was when the crisis was. The FCDA, the Financial Center Development Act, was 81 in that time frame. Tammy, what do you think? What other kinds of stories or issues uniquely?
Well, I think another one that came up this morning, and probably is again, it's an ongoing topic, and it evolves over time and goes in different directions, and that's environmental concerns, environmental issues. And I think that what we're talking about today, it's kind of interesting. We're trying to identify the stories of the moment, so to speak, but really what we're identifying are the issues that percolate along over time and erupt at different junctures depending on circumstances. But I think that environmental issues are still very much at the forefront today. In Sussex County, for example, where you've kind of got that whole concern of environmental issues, development, quality of life, and we're seeing those play out maybe a little bit differently than they were when the Coastal Zone Act was first being discussed. We're not so much concerned about big business anymore, but just kind of that everyday effect of things like poultry farming.
Yeah, the Coastal Zone Act was a unique to Delaware. I'm not sure that any other state could have effectively done that, given it was big for us, but small. But to have just stopped development in that wide a swath, really, it changed the direction of where Delaware's industry
Speaking
went.
of development in that sense, let me just kind of take one more shot at this and then move on to the next set of questions. But when you look at this, when America entered this century, roughly 50% of the population was employed in agriculture, on the farms. In 1950, just 50 years ago, it was 10%. Today, it's less than 1% nationally, and it's probably even less than that in Delaware. You look at that, and you look at the flip side of that, and you've got all the development-related issues. Do you look at this kind of development kind of thing as being a major consequential story that's been covered as such in Delaware?
Development? Certainly in the last 8 or 10 years. I think before that, I think the press is to be faulted for not recognizing what was happening. I mean, we were covering things individually and not seeing the whole picture, not recognizing that every little development was joined to others, and this highway became that highway, and we have what we have now. Well,
let me ask Tammy in that sense, because to some extent we end up, and proudly so, sometimes with two communities, an upstate community and a downstate community. Mm-hmm. Do you think that development of Delaware in that sense has been the issue downstate in public life and public affairs that it has upstate? And do you think that there are any of these other issues that we've talked about that would have had a different resonance downstate?
I think the development issues downstate have unfolded perhaps a little bit differently, because I think that there has been, I won't say more of a concern, but perhaps a different focus at different points on quality of life, and on sometimes clashes between industries and I say industries, again, like farming, like agriculture, that 50 years ago, no one really looked at that as a development issue or as an environmental issue. But now that's very much part of that whole development picture, because you've got the clash of people from sometimes upstate moving downstate and bringing concerns with them, or from out of state to a rural, still fairly rural area, and that maybe has a different perspective on how some of these ought to play out.
I'd like to suggest two things. That anyone who's driven on Route 1 in Sussex or 13, just about a mile from here, clearly sees that there was a certain absence of sensitivity to the environment when they developed those. But I think what has happened in Kent and Sussex is they watched how Newcastle County messed it up, and I think are benefiting from the lessons that they saw there. And I think there has been.
Well, we'd like to say we were wiser in the first place.
We can acknowledge that. Let's when we talk about news, it's tough to talk about news sometimes without talking about the people who report the news. And sometimes we have personalities that rise above the coverage. Sometimes we don't. Upstate, people are certainly going to talk about a legend like a Bill Frank, or downstate, people like a Harry McSherry or Jim Miller. I guess I'd like to get your thoughts if you were looking at reporters, both current and historical. And let's take current first. If there's anyone who really stands out in the kind of tradition of Delaware journalism that we want to be proud of. And that may be a provocative question of its own, because I was thinking about that, and I thought about the Bill Franks and the Jim Millers and the Harry McSherrys, and it's almost tough to come up with a name that carries that kind of respect today that those individuals carried historically.
I think you're right. I wouldn't jump to name anyone. I'm not sure at the same stage anyone would have said that of Bill Frank or Jim Miller or Harry McSherry. They really grew over time, and they made their reputations over several years and did stand out. I mean, I see my friend Harry Thimmel back there, who, clearly as a reporter, an editor, and a columnist has contributed, greatly. And I think there's some. I'm a legend, John. You're a legend. I think that's a difficult thing on our staff. Most of the reporters are younger, and I'm not sure. Jeff Montgomery would stand out for me as I think someone who, over a period of 10 or 15 years, has done a consistently good job on our staff in a variety of different areas, the environment and some other areas. He's he's really a top-notch reporter. There may be some on your staff, Tammy.
I don't know that I would attempt to name names either, because I think we have a lot of good journalists, very capable people in Delaware. But I think that the fact that we can't come up with, like a legend, so to speak, is maybe a good thing, because a good journalist should not necessarily be drawing a lot of attention to himself or herself. And perhaps the fact that we don't have people we can point to right now is maybe an indication of how the media has evolved a little bit in Delaware to institutions that have matured over time.
Yeah, and I think the three that we sort of all mentioned were really operating in a different era when the crossover between columnist and reporter, and it didn't seem to matter as much. I think it does now much more.
Are there any, and I just kind of picked those three because they're people that we're all familiar with in the last quarter century, but are there any others that would come to mind from any of you that are perhaps less obvious in that sense?
No, not to me. I mean,
why don't you?
I'd have to have thought about that.
Let me ask you, for the benefit of our audience who may not have been familiar with those three, John, take 20 or 30 seconds, and it's a tremendous injustice to say that, and talk a moment about Bill Frank. And Tammy, why don't you do the same thing with Jim Miller and Harry McSherry?
Okay. Well, I mean, Bill Frank, worked for the News Journal for more than 60 years, 63, I think it was. He had been in radio and continuing in radio almost till the day he died. He was a reporter. He was a city editor. Covered the legislature. Covered everything upstate. He wrote a column off and on for about 50 of those 63 years, I think. He was a personality of his own making, and just became well known all across the state. He even was made an honorary citizen of Sussex.
David?
Well, Jim Miller and Harry McSherry, I think, were legends in their own right for a couple different reasons. They were strong personalities, real characters, but they also were working for the Delaware State News, which is the publication that I represent here today, and that was a publication that was really in its infancy in the 50s. It started as a daily newspaper, and so they were part of a small group of men who settled in Dover or were from this area, who just went out and had a heck of a time creating a daily newspaper and shaping it the way they envisioned it should occur, which sometimes really ran counter probably to the way the community thought it ought to occur, but it led to a lot of colorful reporting and things that were being covered specifically from a downstate perspective for the first time. Jim was also largely a columnist, very colorful columnist, and was one of those people who really could really touch on those basic human qualities that a lot of us take for granted, but you'd read about and he'd elevate it to an art. And Harry, of course, Harry McSherry, I think he was referred to as the Dean of the Senate at one point. He covered the legislature for many years, and I'm not sure how many. Frank might know that.
I think a couple of others I would add in there now that I had a chance to think about it is Betty Burroughs, who just died the other day. And these are on the softer side. And Tom Malone, who was another columnist at the News Journal. I mean, they went at, they were not real hard news specialists, at least in their column writing. Well, but they had a real impact on people.
The next